Buenos días.
Good morning. First, I'd like to thank the organizers of this session that allow us to go deeper in different proposals. I will speak about the future, but first I'd like to start saying how difficult our present is. Those that try to regulate emotions know how difficult it is. It's very easy to tell somebody else, self or regulate your emotions. You can say, stop it, don't go on. You can say big words, but in fact, to self-regulate ourselves is quite difficult. If I give the example of different habits like drinking, smoking, and all of a sudden we realize that we cannot stop. And this is something that we always see in our neighbors. The others are the bad drivers, the bad teachers, and we are the good ones. And this is how we are. We are the perfect teachers to tell others how to do things. But let's do a proposal. Those four panelists, they are rolling in money, and they are going to do the following proposal. Now, during the coffee break, we're going to give you 1,000 euro. Well, it's not much. 400 people per 1,000, 400,000 euro. But next week, we will give you 1,100. Who would choose the first 1,000? All right. So those are theories about rational decision-making. So the first option is a stupid one, because if you can earn 100 more euros just for waiting a week, why don't we wait for a week? Well, maybe you are not here next week, right? This is how humans think. It's better to have the 1,000 in our hand than 1,100 next week. And this is present in our brain since we're very small, so that sometimes we cannot regulate ourselves, because the sooner you can get something, just get the money and run. This is the problem of regulation. Since we were very small, it was very difficult for us to choose the second option. This was shown by Walter Mischel during the 60s. And this research is still going on at present. Professor Walter Mischel has started a line of research. He's still alive. And he proposed children a very simple task. With a candy, he gave them a candy in front of them and said, I'll be back in a few minutes. This is the following treat. If you don't eat it right now, when I leave the room, I close the door. If you haven't eaten it when I come back, I will give you another one. You will have two. Okay. Then he went out, closed the door, and when he closed the door, 30% of children started eating the candy. As you that had decided that you'd rather have 1,000 euro than 1,100. Another 30% of the children took a few minutes. They waited for a few minutes. And lastly, there were those children that didn't eat it and wait for the researcher to come back. But in this process, they did things which were very different in order to regulate their emotions. For example, they didn't look at the candy or at the money, or you play with your hands, you start looking at the roof, you start singing, or you put your hands into your mouth so that you don't feel tempted. Some just try a little bit of the candy and then put it back on the table. Because to regulate emotions is very difficult, and they had a crisis. There are some videos that are really very funny. Not only in the United States, this experiment has been replicated in different countries. And this is not a cultural subject, so that Americans have difficulties to regulate themselves. This is a universal problem. What is interesting about this study is that there was a follow-up of those children. What happened with them when they became adults? 10, 20 years later, and a few weeks ago, in a very prestigious magazine, a small group of those children, we have compared their brains. What have we found? The brains of those that delayed the gratification, that waited for the researcher and then had two candies, is very different from the other children. The activation areas, when we compare people that are drug addicts or are addicts to gambling, The areas of inhibition of response are more or less activated. So 40 years later, we can see that there are differences in our brains, and that is related to what we did when we were 3 and 4 years old. This had an incredible impact during the rest of our life, and this is related to emotional intelligence, so that people that have more emotional intelligence, they will enjoy some advantages and benefits. Some other speakers will speak about them later on. But people with more emotional intelligence, they are more psychologically balanced. They have less anxiety, less depression, less addictions, less aggressivity, less interpersonal conflicts. And it has many different benefits: social, personal, professional, and in the academic world. And this is where the application of all those principles is important in relation to the school centers. How can we develop those skills? In a classical manner, we could say that at home, in the school. But is this really the case? Is this been the case in Spain? I don't think so, with the exception of some local initiatives in different places, whether in Extremadura regional government or in Santander, Catalonia, Andalucía, and Madrid. Except for very few cases of teachers that are interested in these subjects, that might carry out an initiative and they convince 4 or 5 colleagues and they developed it in their school centers, but this is not being carried out in a systematic manner in our country. Just as I said, a few enthusiasts are the ones that are, in fact, implementing these initiatives. And the proposal here and in other fora is that we need to include that in a spontaneous manner, in an intuitive manner, to stop being an intuition and to start being something explicit with a structure that can be checked and tested, something that we can systematize as a knowledge so that it becomes a science of educating emotions. It's not only an art, but we also need a scientific basis that supports this. And this is what we try to do in this type of meetings, to make something a real science and to be able to check its impact. I will speak about an experience, emotional perception and emotions regulation in children. As Professor Kimberly has mentioned, the benefits after the meta-analysis by Duller and collaborators in all those fields, academic achievement and psychological balance. We are very convinced of this subject, but when you go there to your schools and have to convince the authorities, the administration, and your colleagues of the need to educate in emotional intelligence, sometimes they might tell you, well, listen, with the bad results, PISA results we have, you think we're going to waste our time doing this? Well, there's a study, a longitudinal study conducted in the United States by Professor Carol Izzard, that has shown that training children in those abilities of perception and emotional regulation when they are in kindergarten, after 3 years, when they start primary education, when they're 6 years old, we can see improvements in everything related to social skills, their emotions. They're less aggressive children, more cooperative children. But what is interesting is that those children also had better results in maths and in language. And this is very important. Of course, there are some other variables. There are verbal skills. And why is this important? Teachers and parents, of course, they are interested in academic performance. And what those studies show is that we are a globality. And when we have positive emotions, when we're happy, then we are. How do you work when you're depressed or when you're feeling low, when you're very tired on a Monday morning? How do you go to school or to work? Not very well, right? What happens with the 6-year-old that is afraid of going to school? He or she is sad, see that the context is negative, that he's not going to be valued, he's not going to be motivated, how is he going to have a good economic performance? Science has to sometimes prove things which are really obvious, and until somebody publishes it in an article in a prestigious magazine, we don't realize it. But the common sense of all teachers and academic authorities should realize that we are a globality, and this is what it's all about. To educate is not that you're more than 6 years old, there's nothing we can do with you. It's not true. We can still work with adults. There are programs for people and senior citizens above 65 years. But this part of from 0 to 6 years is essential to educate perception, recognition, and understanding of emotions. The studies conducted show that boys and girls that smile and express more positive emotions, they are more emotionally balanced, they are more assertive, they are more nicer, and they are more cooperative and pro-social. Basically, our proposal is that school has to be focusing in training in scientific fields, cognitive fields, but should never forget emotional and social development. And the second argument that I would like to present really briefly is that, okay, this happens with boys and girls, but what about teachers? Think, please, of a teacher that was very important for you, and just describe it with one word, the first word that comes to your mind. You have probably thought about a teacher. His name is Luis or Mary or Enriqueta. And the quality that you might be thinking is something related to emotions. Somebody that was a motivating teacher, a teacher that was creative, a teacher that supported me emotionally. And therefore, the ideal teacher for us should have theoretical knowledge, of course, and also praxis, should have different skills, teaching skills, and the capacity to convey theory into practice. But they also have to be trained in emotional intelligence. I don't believe in anybody that can teach what they don't know about. But what you teach is not only theoretical knowledge, it's also practical. We could learn English and French with teachers that do not speak English. And that's why Spaniards speak such a bad English, because our English teachers, well, I'm not going to say more. They did their best. Of course, I'm not going to blame them now. They did what they could, but they didn't know English. So how can you learn to drive if your teacher doesn't know how to drive? And they say, you can read this book and tomorrow you start driving. And this is not possible. And the same about social and emotional skills. We request teachers to teach things that they cannot teach. How can they motivate children if they are not motivated themselves? How can we request teachers so that the students express positive emotions if they are always angry in the classroom? This is not possible, because we have, if somebody is sad, we feel sad. If somebody is not motivated, we feel also low. That's the way we work. And if somebody is happy, they transmit the energy. And if we don't know anything about emotional intelligence, we cannot convey it to our children. How can we improve this? This is such a long story. It's not possible in 15 minutes. Perception, understanding, and regulation, and working in a dual axis. My emotions, how do I self-understand my emotions, my emotional awareness, my capacity to understand my emotional status, and lastly, if I can change them or modify them. When we speak about regulating, we're not speaking about repressing emotions. To regulate means to know how to play with emotions, sometimes up, sometimes down. In some cases, we have to increase the intensity of our emotions, and in some others, we will have to decrease them, not to repress them. We just should know when this is the right emotion, with what people, and in relation to my objectives. And therefore, is an intelligent use of our emotions, so that our prefrontal cortex is related to our emotional side. so that we don't have two small monsters inside our brain as Mr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And this is good for your children, but there's another reason, so that you don't end up being crazy as teachers. The tiredness, the burnt out is something that we say, well, this happens to other teachers. But the depression rates and anxiety rates among teachers are very high in our country. We compare it with the professions of high risk. So just to protect yourself, studies show that teachers with more emotional intelligence, they are not so burnt out. So the final proposal would be to promote emotional and social education as soon as possible, at least from 2 years in the school centers, in the curriculum. That the future of our hearts will depend on this, and also of our brains. Thank you very much for your attention.